Now, on the 20th century.
Unidentified communist espionage rings are still operating in the United States government.
McCarthy Reconsidered.
The McCarthy persecution was absolutely needless.
But new evidence suggests that Joe McCarthy, who was vilified for creating a climate of fear as he falsely accused countless Americans of communist subversion, may not have been totally wrong.
There was espionage going on. There was actually a serious internal communist threat.
I'm Mike Wallace, and this is the 20th century. The early 1950s were a dark time for many in America. Accusations of widespread communist subversion led to a climate of fear, even paranoia. Rumors and whispers of communist leanings were enough to raise suspicions about almost anyone, and many people lost their jobs as a result. It was called McCarthyism, named such after the most controversial public figure of the period, Senator Joseph McCarthy.
We simply cannot play the game of being nice to communists. There will be no lasting peace so long as the communist conspiracy survives.
That was how Joe McCarthy operated. In a few short years, he built a career on cleaning out, as he put it, communist traitors who were secretly at work in the U.S. government.
Did you solemnly swear to tell the truth?
A Republican, the junior senator from Wisconsin, he used his chairmanship of the Senate Committee on Government Operations as his springboard, often blending his questions with smears.
Do I understand you have never paid any money to the Communist Party? Is that correct?
That's right.
And you've never attended any communist meetings?
No, sir, I have not.
You are not here because you are considered important in the communist apparatus. We have the testimony that you have been a communist. Other officers of your union, members of the Communist Party?
I couldn't answer that.
You mean you don't know that any of them are?
McCarthy was certainly not the first public official to go after so-called Reds in sensitive positions. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover attacked communists before and then after World War II.
Communism in reality is not a political party. It is a way of life, an evil and malignant way of life.
Americans, in fact, had a complicated relationship with communism. Many joined the Communist Party in the 1930s, believing it to be the best vehicle for social progress, and the Soviet Union was their model. But such utopian ideals were shattered for many when Joseph Stalin formed a friendship pact with communism's arch-enemy, Adolf Hitler. But then came World War II, and the Soviet Union fought as an ally of the U.S. But that alliance changed dramatically almost as soon as the war ended.
The United States came out of the Second World War in a paradoxical position. It was without question the most powerful country on earth for the first time in its history, but at the same time it felt itself imperiled by a rival power, the Soviet Union.
The connection between American communism and the Soviet Union began to make it appear to many people that communism in this country was some kind of threat.
The Communist Party of the United States is a fifth column, if there ever was one. It is far better organized than were the Nazis in occupied countries prior to their capitulation.
The House of Representatives Un-American Activities Committee, first established in the late 1930s to counter a domestic threat from Nazism, turned to uprooting the perceived communist menace within the United States. With a sure political instinct for publicity, its members picked the high-profile industry of motion pictures to investigate. In 1947, congressmen began hearings on alleged Soviet subversion in Hollywood.
Mr. Stripling, the next witness.
The first HUAC witnesses were famous, friendly, and eager to please.
I have never read Karl Marx, and I don't know the basis of communism beyond what I've picked up from hearsay. What I've heard, I don't like it.
They've been hiding behind the labor setup. They get themselves closely tied up in the labor thing so that if you try to get rid of them, they'd make a labor case out of it.
Then came the so-called unfriendly witnesses.
Question is, have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
I'm framing my answer in the only way in which any American citizen can frame his
Then you
answer
denied,
to a question
then you,
which invades his, absolutely invades
then
his
you
right.
denied, you refused to answer that question. Is that correct? John Howard Lawson refused to answer the question, are you a member of the Communist Party? Or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? And other questions.
In the end, 7 screenwriters, 2 directors, and 1 producer refused to answer the committee's questions. They became known as the Hollywood 10, and all of them went to jail for contempt of Congress.
We thought that we had a right to believe what we wanted to believe, and even though I wasn't a communist, I thought it was a matter of principle.
But most of Hollywood buckled under the pressure. More than 300 writers, directors, and actors, informed upon by colleagues as suspected communists or having communist sympathies, were blacklisted and put out of work, causing lasting bitterness in the industry.
Some of my friends and colleagues and blacklisted people won't talk to people who were informers and maintain this attitude to this day.
From the glitz of the movies, the committee moved on to the grit of espionage. 2 self-confessed communist agents who had broken with the party, Elizabeth Bentley, an ex-school teacher, and Whittaker Chambers, a journalist, had given evidence to the FBI about their spying contacts in government. But with each of them, investigators did not feel they had enough evidence to justify any arrests.
Chambers gave a lot of testimony to the FBI. Some of his testimony is internally inconsistent. Chambers is a very weird and interesting character. He was quite a brilliant writer, but he was also very self-destructive and very dramatic.
Leaks to the press of Chambers' FBI statements whetted the appetite of the committee, and so they subpoenaed him, and his evidence on August 3, 1948 was a bombshell. He said that Alger Hiss, a former senior assistant to the Secretary of State, had helped him spy for the Soviet Union in the 1930s, when, Chambers claimed, both he and Hiss had secretly been members of the Communist Party.
Mr. Hiss represents the concealed enemy against which we are all fighting, and I am fighting. I don't hate Mr. Hiss. We were close friends, but we are caught in the tragedy of history.
Alger Hiss, a brilliant graduate of Harvard Law School, had clerked for Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes before embarking on a glittering career in government. He firmly denied Whittaker Chambers' claims.
I am not and never have been a member of the Communist Party. I do not and never have adhered to the tenets of the Communist Party.
Hiss had a patrician style, and as a rising State Department staffer, he had accompanied President Roosevelt to the Yalta Summit Conference.
A great many people found it very difficult to think that someone like Alger Hiss, from a WASP background and elite educational background, could be a spy.
But Whittaker Chambers had an ace in the hole, a precaution he had taken when he broke with the Communist Party and stopped spying for the Soviet Union.
He took with him the last batch of documents, confidential documents he had received from his various contacts in the government. 10 years later, when he gave his testimony against Alger Hiss, and Hiss denied all of Chambers' allegations, even the mildest of them, and threatened Chambers with a slander suit, with a fairly high price, $75,000, a lot of money 50 years ago. Chambers then delivered the documentary evidence.
Chambers led committee investigators to the evidence, concealed in a farm he owned. The document's bizarre hiding place led inevitably to their being called the Pumpkin Papers.
In the latest sensational turn of the Red espionage probe, the Maryland farm of the magazine editor becomes the focus of attention. Of particular interest is the pumpkin patch, which provides the hiding place for the crucial document. Nestling innocently in the patch is this pumpkin, which gave concealment to the filmed copies of the papers.
Congressman Richard Nixon, who had vigorously questioned Hiss in committee, seized on the microfilm material. With the committee counsel by his side, Nixon called a news conference.
I am holding in my hand a microfilm of very highly confidential, secret State Department documents. These documents were fed out of the State Department over 10 years ago by communists who were employees of that department.
Eventually, the complicated case wound up in federal court, where Alger Hiss was convicted in January 1950 and imprisoned, not for espionage, but for perjury in denying that he'd spied. The case remained controversial as Hiss and his many defenders strenuously maintained his innocence until his death in 1996, and some supporters continued their defense even after his death.
Hiss seemed to represent the very best that establishment liberalism had to offer. So as a liberal, as a right-thinking, high-minded liberal, one's impulse was to deny and then to protect and defend, to close ranks around Alger Hiss.
At the time, though, Alger Hiss's defenders were almost drowned out by the anti-communist crusade launched by the junior senator from Wisconsin, Senator Joe McCarthy. That story when the 20th century continues. For Joe McCarthy, as a freshman Republican senator running for re-election, it was perfect timing. The House Un-American Activities Committee hearings and the Alger Hiss case had heightened the nation's fears about communist subversion. McCarthy began his notorious crusade, charging that communists were rampant in the federal government, in February of 1950, just 19 days after Alger Hiss was convicted and sent to prison.
I have in my hand a document which I've never used before.
McCarthy was the supreme fraud and charlatan of all times, which is remarkable because he was by no means that bright. But what he was very clever at, remarkably clever, was at innuendo, slander.
McCarthy had watched the House Un-American Activities Committee investigation of Alger Hiss propel Congressman Richard Nixon to sudden prominence, but McCarthy himself was languishing. He had been named America's worst senator by a poll of correspondents and was worried about his chances for re-election. He desperately needed a rallying cause that would resonate in his home state and beyond.
McCarthy came out of a rural or suburban Midwest at a time when it felt a mounting resentment that dated back to the early years of the New Deal against the liberal policymakers, the technocrats and bureaucrats. And McCarthy tied that resentment against government and Washington and the establishment itself to the specific danger posed by Soviet espionage. He said that the treason began at Harvard and Yale and at the State Department and the very precincts where our political culture was being supervised.
As well as anti-elitism, McCarthy felt that he could rely on an even wider and more deeply rooted popular sentiment, the apparently timeless American fear of an enemy within.
Throughout American history, we've always focused on some kind of internal enemy in the United States that is somehow eating away at American institutions. Back in the 17th century, there was this feeling that Indians were somehow destroying America. In the late 19th century, it was immigrants. And in the 20th century, it comes out to be communists.
Though McCarthy instinctively sensed that blending paranoia about communism with Midwestern populism could bring him political success, he still had a problem. He was short on facts. At the time, journalist Jack Anderson was working as a reporter for columnist Drew Pearson.
He came to me after he discovered the communist issue and said he had nothing and that he needed some help. and he asked me whether I had anything in my files.
McCarthy's ambition was simply to raise hell, get reelected, get himself in the headlines.
He said, I've got a hot issue. I think that we can push this issue, but I don't have anything to back it up. He didn't quite put it that baldly, but that was the sense of it.
In February of 1950, Senator McCarthy, still lacking hard evidence, but armed with a clipping of a Richard Nixon speech and his own imagination, embarked on a weekend speaking tour. In Wheeling, West Virginia, he told a Republican women's club that he held in his hand a list of 205 Communist Party members known to the Secretary of State, but still working in the State Department.
But he didn't know of any communists. What he knew about, vaguely, were security probes that had been conducted under President Truman and that had not resulted in the expulsion of every name that had come before the investigators. So he cleverly characterized those as remnants of the communist underground when he had no knowledge of this whatsoever.
What Joe McCarthy apparently had done, and not even accurately, was to subtract the number of government employees who had been fired or who had moved on from the total number of people investigated. But by the time he changed planes in Denver on his way to Reno that weekend, the number had dwindled from 205 to 57. A Denver Post photographer took this picture of McCarthy rummaging through his briefcase in search, he said, of the revealing list. Once back in Washington, his number had grown from 57 to 81.
What had always worked for him was hit and run. A speech in St. Louis today attacking the communists and giving out a list, 128 communists, and then you get on the plane or the train and you go to Chicago and you give out another speech and another list, and you're never there to answer the charge, and then you're on to Omaha and you give another speech and another number. He was always staying, in effect, one step ahead of the sheriff.
Within a few months of his Wheeling speech, McCarthy had achieved his immediate goal. The relatively unknown politician became one of the most familiar public figures in America.
The Republican Party was overjoyed. They didn't really like McCarthy's methods. He was kind of a brutal guy. But they loved the publicity. They loved the way he was hurting the Truman administration.
McCarthy's management of the press was critical, and the timing of his accusations, only just making newspaper deadlines, denied journalists the time to check out his wild claims.
He played them like a yo-yo, and they were glad to be the yo-yo in general. Hey, I'm just doing my job. He's a senator, he said it.
The communist agents are gathering information.
And so McCarthy's reckless accusations spread across the nation, and to a lot of Americans, Joe McCarthy made sense. After all, the Alger Hiss affair was still fresh in the minds of many.
The fact that all the evidence showed that Hiss was guilty and that after a second trial, Hiss was convicted, this said to the American people, if there's Hiss, there must in fact be others.
Alger Hiss and Frank Coe recommended Adlai Stevenson.
And McCarthy's charges, outrageous and irresponsible and as demagogic as they might be, had resonance with a lot of people.
What's worse, shortly after McCarthy began his campaign, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were charged with helping the Russians steal American atom bomb secrets. So it was no surprise that what was now being called McCarthyism began to extend far beyond Washington, deep into ordinary Americans' working lives. Blacklisting, until then only part of the movie industry, became widespread, and people from all walks of life were subjected to so-called loyalty tests.
The numbers of people who lost their jobs or were blacklisted run to somewhere between 10 and 15,000. It may be higher because a lot of people were secret victims.
The mounting pursuit of alleged subversives led, within 4 years, to Joe McCarthy being celebrated as the country's leading anti-communist campaigner. But ironically, it was the very publicity McCarthy had so desperately sought that started his sudden downfall in 1954. Most Americans knew about McCarthy only from the printed word, so they were shocked when Edward R. Murrow suddenly showed him on the new medium of television, making his wild charges and badgering witnesses.
The question is, did the Civil Liberties Union supply you with an attorney?
They did supply an attorney.
The answer is yes.
The answer is yes.
You know, the Civil Liberties Union has been listed as a front for and doing the work of the Communist Party.
The Reed-Harris hearing demonstrates one of the senator's techniques. Twice, he said the American Civil Liberties Union was listed as a subversive front. The Attorney General's list does not and has never listed the ACLU as subversive, nor does the FBI or any other federal government agency.
Murrow closed his half-hour television expose with an editorial condemning McCarthy and his methods.
The actions of the junior senator from Wisconsin have caused alarm and dismay amongst our allies abroad and given considerable comfort to our enemies. And whose fault is that? Not really his. He didn't create this situation of fear, he merely exploited it, and rather successfully.
A month later, McCarthy went on Murrow's program, See It Now, to give his reply. But the reply did him more damage than the original broadcast.
Now, ordinarily, I would not take time out from the important work at hand to answer Murrow. However, in this case, I feel justified in doing so because Murrow is the symbol, the leader, and the cleverest of the jackal pack, which is always found at the throat of anyone who dares to expose individual communists and traitors.
On television, people began to see the human face of McCarthy in their living room, and it was a face they did not like. It was the face of a bully. It was the face of an intimidator.
A few weeks after his exchange with Murrow, McCarthy tried to intimidate the U.S. Army, which he accused of harboring communists.
How long were you in the military?
16 years.
16 years? Do you think it's a good policy to give honorable discharges to members of the communist conspiracy?
Millions of Americans sat glued to their television sets as McCarthy was skewered by the Army's civilian attorney, Joseph Welch.
And if there is a God in heaven, it will do neither you nor your cause any good. I will not discuss it further. I will not ask Mr. Cohen any more witnesses. You, Mr. Chairman, may, if you will, call the next witness.
Are there any questions to come from the members of the church?
Joseph Welch was cool and skillful in drawing out McCarthy the bully on national television. McCarthy never recovered.
The press that had created Joe McCarthy now cut him off at the knees. There was no such thing as a McCarthy story. Editors would actually tell the reporters, I don't want to hear about Joe McCarthy.
The Republican Party, too, now found McCarthy to be a liability.
Because he was amoral, he didn't understand it. He didn't understand why they wouldn't touch him. It was all a game. But he didn't understand. And he cried in the end and drank too much, and it killed him.
Joe McCarthy, censured by the Senate and stripped of his committee chairmanship, died on May 2nd, 1957. He was just 48 years old.
It was just nothing but recklessness fueled by alcoholism.
I don't think he understood how destructive his stories were, how ruinous they were.
McCarthy never found a single communist in government.
J. Robert Oppenheimer.
Fact is, historical evidence emerging during the half-century since McCarthy's death showed that very few of the people accused of disloyalty and subversion in the 50s were active members of the Communist Party.
The people who lost their jobs and were blacklisted, the people who were called up before congressional committees, who were cited for contempt, who risked going to jail, the people who were threatened with deportation, the main victims of McCarthyism were, on the whole, people who had been in or near the Communist Party during the 1930s and 40s.
McCarthy, it turned out, had used outdated reports and allegations to pursue people who no longer posed a threat to national security, if in fact they ever had. But it was an unrelated and all too real case of Soviet espionage that helped boost McCarthy's credibility for a while. In 1950, just 6 months after McCarthy made his initial speech in West Virginia, Julius Rosenberg was arrested by the FBI and charged with helping to steal the secrets of the atomic bomb. That story when the 20th century returns. Against the backdrop of Joe McCarthy's crusade against communism, one case in particular came to convince many that there was a serious communist threat at work inside America. In 1949, the Soviet Union had stunned the world by exploding its first atomic bomb. That single blast upset the global balance of power and shattered the United States' post-war complacency. Americans wondered, how had those backward Russians caught up with America's brilliant atomic scientists? Americans soon had themselves an answer: espionage, treason.
One of the greatest peacetime spy dramas in the nation's history reaches its climax as Julius Rosenberg and Morton Sobel, convicted of revealing atomic secrets to the Russians, enter the federal building in New York to hear their doom. Another of the spy ring, Mrs. Ethel Rosenberg, who with her husband was convicted of actually transmitting the secrets to Russia through Soviet diplomatic channels.
The FBI had arrested Julius Rosenberg, a radio engineer, in July of 1950. His wife Ethel a month later. It was the culmination of a 5-year investigation that began when Igor Guzenko, a cipher clerk, defected from the Soviet embassy in Canada. His debriefing eventually led to the arrest of Klaus Fuchs, a German-born scientist working at Great Britain's Atomic Research Center. Fuchs had previously been with America's top-secret Manhattan Project at Los Alamos that eventually produced the atomic bomb. And Fuchs admitted that while at Los Alamos, he had supplied design details of the bomb to the Soviets.
Klaus Fuchs began to confess to what he was doing. He was living in Britain, and he confessed to Scotland Yard about what he did. The FBI began to become very interested in who his contacts were.
Fuchs' contacts led the FBI to a former U.S. Army sergeant named of David Greenglass.
David Greenglass, Mrs. Rosenberg's brother, confessed theft of the secrets while stationed at the Los Alamos Atomic Project. He later became the government's chief witness in the prosecution of Sobel and the Rosenbergs.
At the trial, David Greenglass's evidence helped convict both the Rosenbergs and their co-defendant, the electrical engineer Morton Sobel, of conspiracy to commit espionage. But since Sobel could not be directly connected to actual bomb secrets, he was given simply a prison sentence. Things were much worse for the Rosenbergs.
It is a stern jurist they face in Judge Irving Kaufman. After administering a tongue lashing, he sentenced both Rosenbergs to death in the electric chair.
After the Rosenberg sentencing in 1951, hundreds of protest rallies and demonstrations erupted at home and abroad. Many Americans, however, inflamed by Senator Joe McCarthy's anti-communist crusade, strongly approved of the sentences. All the same, Rosenberg sympathizers continued to protest right up until the time the Rosenberg couple were finally executed in 1953.
There were rioting and demonstrations around the world and pickets at the White House when Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were electrocuted at Sing Sing prison. In the end, President Eisenhower refused clemency. Michael and Robert Rosenberg, aged 10 and 6, paid a final visit to their parents at Sing Sing. 25 years later, they and their supporters are still fighting to clear the Rosenbergs' name, still insisting their parents were railroaded in a climate of hysteria.
The death sentence was seen as a way of putting enough pressure on them so that eventually they would confess. He didn't, she didn't, and they were both killed.
But the fact that they held firm, that they allowed themselves to go to their deaths and be martyrs for the communist cause, served them very well. Because despite the thousands, perhaps millions, put to death by Stalin in the Gulag, the only 2 Americans put to death in a country not known for political executions. This gave the communists a huge propaganda weapon, and they played it to the hilt.
The execution of the Rosenbergs stirred controversy in the United States for half a century, with repeated attempts by their supporters to assert their innocence. That was largely because the government refused to release secret information about the Rosenbergs that was never used at their trial. It could not be made public, authorities believed, because that would have revealed too much to the Soviets about U.S. counterintelligence. Not, that is, until 1995.
A Cold War blast from the past, some of the best-kept secrets of the eyeball-to-eyeball, spy versus spy days of the U.S. and the Soviet Union finally came spilling out of the CIA today.
That previously secret information now pointed to some firm, and some would say final assessments of the Rosenberg case.
The material that was uncovered confirmed 100% everything that we know about Julius Rosenberg. It refers to the network he set up, to the individuals he recruited for that network. It lays out the entire record. Julius's code name was first Antenna, which probably refers to the fact that his field was radio engineering, and later it was changed to Liberal.
And Liberal, in one of the messages, is described as having a wife named Ethel, and that wasn't a cover name, that was her actual name. She didn't have a cover name. It also gave Ethel's age and how long she'd been married to Liberal.
The newly available documents suggested that the information from Liberal, Julius Rosenberg, had helped the Soviets confirm atomic bomb details stolen by other spies. The new evidence also indicated that whatever Julius may have done, the government did not play fair with Ethel Rosenberg. Historians concluded that she had indeed been threatened with the death penalty simply as a tactic to make her husband confess, for she was evidently not a major player herself.
She was politically involved. She had been, as her husband had been, a member of the Communist Party, no question about that. But she was not a spy.
Looking back on the evidence, to me, she looks not as a principal in the case, but simply as Julius Rosenberg's assistant. She does not look like a major spy, a rather minor one.
The belief was that, given that they had two young children, that he would break in order to get her off. The secret documents recently released do confirm that although she was fully aware of what her husband was doing, she herself was the traditional housewife, staying home and taking care of the kids.
If the new documents reduced Ethel Rosenberg's role in the case, they implicated deeply for the first time a man called Ted, or Theodore Hall, a young Los Alamos scientist. Historians were startled when references to him showed up in the declassified files.
The biggest revelation was a number of messages which clearly identify a major Soviet atomic source, a young physicist named Theodore Hall, who was totally unknown to the public and to most scholars.
Ted Hall, who by the time of the revelations was nearly 70 and living in Cambridge, England, had originally been listed by the KGB with a Russian code name inspired by his extreme youth.
Malad, which means youngster, and a rather obvious reference to his young age, because he was working for them at age 19.
But the young agent Mlad could not be arrested and tried because U.S. counterintelligence did not want to tip off the KGB as to how much they knew about Russian codes.
Essentially, the FBI and the Justice Department said, well, we know he's a spy, and there's nothing we can do about it. We can make sure he doesn't work on American security projects again, but it's a lost cause as far as prosecution is concerned, and so Theodore Hall got away with it.
While Ted Hall may have gotten away with it, Ethel and Julius Rosenberg were executed. And the man who personified the hunt for communist subversion, Senator Joe McCarthy, had nothing to do with tracking them down. Nonetheless, it was probably the hysterical climate of McCarthyism that made it impossible for the government to show mercy to Ethel Rosenberg. That's one conclusion historians drew from the evidence that became available only toward the century's end. More about those revelations when the 20th century returns. While controversy raged for 4 decades over the conviction and the execution of the Rosenbergs, and over the disputed guilt of Alger Hiss, there was also a softening of hostility toward the American Communist Party. Many party members, it was said, had been naive idealists or misguided romantics, but not especially dangerous. In fact, some people even came to doubt that the party itself had been controlled by the Soviet Union or that it had engaged in espionage. But that view changed when the American Communist Party's secret records were discovered, not in the United States, but in Moscow in 1993.
It was not known at that time that the American Party's records existed. There have been rumors that they'd been shipped to Moscow many years ago, but that could have been just an apocryphal story. No one knew it to be true.
So the Library of Congress sent John Earl Haynes, one of its manuscript specialists, to post-communist Moscow to negotiate a deal that would allow access to the official files of the American Communist Party.
They wheeled in the first boxes of records, and sure enough, it was the American Communist Party's original headquarters records. Not copies, but carbons of outgoing letters, the original incoming letters, internal memos, everything you could think of. 4,313 file folders. It was a tremendous prize. From a historian's point of view, it was being a pig in clover.
But could all the records be trusted? The historians needed corroboration, and they got it when the CIA declassified some of their files. During World War II and afterwards, cable traffic between the Soviet embassy in Washington and the Kremlin had been decoded by the CIA's predecessors in counterintelligence. In a project named Venona, code-breaking teams worked round the clock in a converted Virginia school, uncovering top-secret information that was only finally made public in 1995.
Today, the CIA and the rest of the intelligence agencies do it all with computers. Back then, it was all pencil and paper and long, long hours.
Meredith Gardner cracked the first message in 1946, and word by decoded word, the workings of the Soviet spy ring came to light.
These messages included traffic from the KGB revealing details of extensive espionage activities targeted at the U.S. atom bomb program.
The Venona decodings confirmed what historians had discovered in Moscow, that more members of the American Communist Party had been working for the KGB than had been suspected.
We were not talking about a few dozen people altogether. We were talking about several hundred people.
The document showed that Earl Browder, the General Secretary of the American Communist Party, worked directly with the KGB. Eugene Dennis, who succeeded him, continued the clandestine arrangement.
The party also had a regular liaison officer who worked with the KGB, one on the East Coast and one on the West Coast. So the cooperation was not just some communists with the KGB. It was a cooperation of the Communist Party as an institution with the KGB.
Overall, a much fuller picture of Soviet spying in the 40s and 50s emerged from the combined evidence of Venona and the Moscow papers. There was new information, for instance, implicating Alger Hiss.
What we know from two sets of documents in Washington and also in Moscow is that Alger Hiss was indeed an agent of the Soviet Union.
Scholars, in fact, detected Hiss, under his apparent code name Ailes, in just one Venona document. He made such a rare appearance, evidently, because he worked for Soviet military intelligence, the GRU, and not for the KGB. And the Venona project generally covered only KGB communications.
The one message which is about Hiss is, in fact, a KGB message about one of their officers meeting with a GRU source, Ailes, and it rather looks like the KGB was wondering whether they should take him over. Because the KGB had authority to appropriate GRU sources because they were the senior service. And it's a report on that meeting, and its description of Ailes fits Alger Hiss to a T.
The cable talks of an agent codenamed Ailes who had been working for Soviet military intelligence since 1935, and who the National Security Agency says was probably Alger Hiss. The cable says that after the Yalta Conference, Ailes went on to Moscow and was personally thanked by a senior Soviet diplomat. But what's to say Ailes was Hiss?
Mr. Hiss attended the Yalta Conference and with a group of his colleagues stopped over in Moscow thereafter.
If you look at the people who attended the Yalta Conference, most came right home to the United States. Hiss was among three who went on to Moscow. Hiss said publicly he went to Moscow to see the famed Stalin subway, which is more than ludicrous, but everything else in that document would fit only Hiss.
And secondly, the materials in KGB files and Soviet intelligence files that have recently been published actually name Hiss, not even with a code name, identify him as an agent.
At the time of Yalta, President Roosevelt did not suspect that his aide Hiss might be a spy, and at the next summit conference in Potsdam, President Truman did not suspect that Joseph Stalin might know as much about the top-secret American atomic bomb as he did. These were among the disturbing Cold War insights that historians found in the newly available documents.
They have showed, much to the shock and dismay and amazement of many people, that in fact the Soviets had top-level infiltration. The Soviet KGB had done a fantastic job.
Some of these people, it is true, did give secret information to the Russians. We now know there were about 300 people in the federal government who did give this information in one or another way.
So did the fresh 1990s evidence vindicate the anti-communist fear and suspicion of the 1950s?
It offers that kind of a broad vindication of anti-communist concerns and of a concern with espionage and the connections between the American Party and Soviet espionage. It does not offer any particular support for the particular targets of Joseph McCarthy.
Indeed, some historians concluded from the new evidence that McCarthy's spy mania was already out of date by the time his crusade got going.
The McCarthy persecution was absolutely needless. There was nothing that needed to be rooted out that had not already been. The latest documentation shows that by the mid to late 1940s, the Soviets had already begun to dismantle the spy rings because they knew the United States was now beginning to penetrate them, that our counterintelligence had reached a point where it couldn't go on any longer. So at that moment, the moment when the crisis had passed, for it then to usher in the reign of terror is maybe the greatest tragedy of the entire period.
But other scholars were not so sure that the Soviet threat was already much diminished.
I don't think they stopped their intelligence operations. From Venona, we have all of these other cover names of people who were not identified. We don't know who they were. And did they continue to work for the Soviets? Well, some probably did.
Some of the ex-Soviet agents, KGB people alive at the time, say that in fact these people carried on their work virtually till the collapse of the Soviet Union.
The new revelations caused some historians to go further, to suggest that Joe McCarthy himself may deserve a second look.
I don't think he was right. I know that there are people who are saying he was right, but his charge, for example, that people who were under communist influence infiltrated the State Department and distorted American policy, that's not true.
Was it as repressive, as horrible a period as we seem to think? Was America really grasped by a reign of terror that it was the equivalent of the Soviet Gulag? Or was it something more mild with perhaps some abuses of justice, some false accusations, some people suffering unnecessarily? But what really happened?
The revelation that many of the accused spies of the 1940s were in fact spies does not therefore mean that firing a university professor because 7 years earlier he had belonged to the Communist Party is just. It's still unjust.
What you might call the revisionist consensus of the last 20 years is crumbling, and in fact I think pretty well destroyed. There is certainly room for a lot more research and for more scholarship. A new consensus remains a few years down the road.
A new consensus may be a long time coming because the polemics surrounding that era can sometimes sound as fierce now as they were half a century ago. I'll have some final thoughts when the 20th century returns. Historians will argue over the full implications of the new evidence from American and Soviet Cold War archives, but it seems fair to conclude that Yes, there was a lot of effective Soviet spying in the United States, and yes, the American Communist Party was by no means an innocent bystander. Based on the new evidence, it also seems fair to conclude that Alger Hiss was guilty, and so were the Rosenbergs, though Ethel Rosenberg was probably unjustly punished with execution. What remains to be determined is the true legacy of Joe McCarthy. Even if historians finally decide that his wide-bore approach to rooting out communists actually may have hit a target or two, there were few who lived through that era when loyal Americans feared and mistrusted their neighbors who would want anyone to experience a time like that ever again. I'm Mike Wallace, and this is the 20th Century.